As a writer, I think any creative person, self-doubt is a very, very big part of, your journey. And you're constantly asking yourself, am I good enough? Is this good enough? So I started writing stories because many of our stories in Indian mythology are about adoption. Sita is adopted, Karna is adopted, Krishna is adopted. If there is a certain situation and I want to do something, I would just, try it and not feel that, oh, I'm not going to be able to do it because I'm a woman. So I think that conditioning is very important. History has largely been told by men and written by powerful men. And large part of women's stories are, they're not even written or discussed or spoken about. It's a series of mysteries for young readers, legal mysteries because of my legal background, where children can learn about legal and police procedure in India through mystery. If you see the Battle for Baramulla, the main characters are actually Zuni and her grandmother. There's a young girl, a 14-year-old girl, and her grandmother, who actually is the seed of wisdom throughout the story. Many of my characters in my stories are women, and I think, what I said previously, presence is very important. Women who see themselves, girls see themselves, making it engaging for the children and appealing for them and overcome these notions which they have of history is boring by telling them that there is more to history than what you see in your textbooks. Your opinions, your future, who you're going to vote for, what kind of country you're going to have, what kind of society you're going to have, is shaped by your views on history, because that is constantly being used by those in power to shape your opinion.
Absolutely. Hi, Malika, and welcome to the About Her show, a show where we get trailblazing women to share the story of their lives with us. To tell us about their successes, failures, challenges, ups and downs, all of it, so that not only do they get a platform to showcase themselves, but they also help us inspire other women. Women who have dreams, ambitions, but for some reason have not been able to follow those dreams. So we want them to listen to you, to all that you've gone through, and get inspired. And then, along with women, we also get men on the show because we believe that for a truly gender inclusive world, men and women need to be allies in this journey. Now, when I was looking at your profile, you wear not only so many hats, but very diverse ones also. So, yes, someone who did an MA in history, went on to become a lawyer, got into writing and then writing for the young adults, and then, of course, your love for the trees. So, these are all, this makes for a very, very interesting and a personality which, yes, someone we definitely want on the show. So, like I said, a very, very warm welcome to you on the About Her show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sangeeta. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have taken a look, at some of your earlier shows and the people you've got and the inspiring conversations you've had. So it's really a pleasure to be here and be a part of the conversation. And if it inspires other women, I mean, even better. That's a wonderful way to contribute and give back. So happy to be here. Thank
Absolutely.
you so much for the invitation.
You're more than welcome. And actually, that's the whole point because we do want women to get inspired. Men too, if they want, but largely women.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So let's dive in with the first question. So, like you won these awards, the Ata Galata Bangalore Festival Award for Best Children's Fiction in 2023, and then the Binod Kanoria Children's Book Award again in 2023 in the Young Adult category. Now, how have these recognitions shaped your journey as a writer?
Yes, that's a interesting question to begin with, because that is actually not the start of the journey, but you're asking me something that happened more recently. And usually people tend to start with the beginning, so it's very nice to look at it the other way. And it's very important because I think it gives the awards. In the last 2 weeks ago, another award that one of my books, one was the FICCI award for jury mention for 565, another one of my books. Wow. So each of these is a milestone in the sense that it gives you more confidence, because as a writer, I think any creative person, self-doubt is a very, very big part of, your journey. And you're constantly asking yourself, am I good enough? Is this good enough? 6 years ago, the only question in my head was, will anybody want to publish anything I write? So the questions are, and even now it's always there, will this editor want to work with me? Or will this be good enough for, for publication and things like questions like that are always part of your creative journey. So these awards, in one sense it is superficial and so on, but in the other sense it is also gives you a lot of confidence, because it is sort of reassurance from the industry, from your peers, from people who work with books and literature and so on, to say that you're in the right direction, your work is valued, your work is respected. So it gives you a lot of confidence to then pitch further, to experiment with ideas. For example, some of the ideas that I worked with, the book that we're going to be talking about, the Battle for Baramulla, it's about Kashmir. It's a very complex story.
Mm.
Telling that story to young readers is also not easy. The sensitive issue, it's a burning current affairs issue and so on. So initially, 5 years ago, I may have thought, no, I don't have the ability to write this story for a young audience. But the awards and recognitions give you that confidence, saying, let me try. I might be able to pull it off. So definitely boosts your confidence in this writing journey.
Yes, I'm sure, because I think, till you don't get that validation, someone has to tell you,
Yeah.
of course, people around you and the editors, and the fact that your book got published, yes, is a lot of validation. But then the people who read your book, the people for whom the book is based, if it comes from there, obviously, it is, I think, like you said, I mean,
Yes.
something that every creative person and definitely a writer would want. So we'll come to your
Yeah.
book
Yeah.
later. But before that, going back, so we, a little bit about your early days. So, as I understand, you are a lawyer turned author. Okay. So
Right.
the question is that what made you take the leap from law to literature? And how did that transition influence your storytelling style?
Yeah, so yes, I was a lawyer. I used to practice in the Bombay High Court. I was very happy in my profession. It's not like I left because I wasn't, satisfied. I was very happy. I was working. I was getting good work. I was in a good chamber. I worked in a law firm first, and then I did litigation in the High Court with a senior counsel. And then I also wanted to do some more meaningful work. So I would work. I was working part time with a human rights organization, Colin Gonzalez's outfit called HRLN, which did public interest litigation. I worked with people with disabilities. So I was doing good commercial work to make the money, and also, doing satisfying work sort of with some other part of my week. So I was very happy doing what I was doing. The reason I switched to writing the last few years is because after my children were born, so I used to live about 1.5 hours away from the High Court. So, and living in Mumbai, the commute, the traffic and the commute is very, exhausting. So 1.5 hours one way. And so 3 hours of my day would go in commuting from my house to the High Court, which was okay when I didn't have children. But once my children were born, I didn't want to spend so much time on the road. So I took time off from work. And then I started writing stories for them when they were little, and
Mhm.
stories for their friends. A number of my children's friends were adopted. So that it all actually began when I overheard a conversation between my son and his friend who happened to be adopted. They were 3 years old, and she had just been told that she's adopted. So, and I had just recently told my son stories about, what is a mammal and what is a fish, and what is a bird and so on. And the way you define things for little children, a mammal is somebody who's born from their mama's tummy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And my friend's daughter, who was adopted, had also heard a similar expression from her mother, but in this context of adoption, she had been told that she is not born from her mama's tummy.
Hmm.
So my son and his friend are having this conversation, and the friend is very excitedly telling him, I was not born from my mama's tummy. And my son is very confused, and he says, "Oh, that means you're not a mammal." So it was a hilarious conversation between two 3-year-olds. And that set me off on my journey of I need to explain to my son, because not just that friend, but a few other friends were also adopted. And I wanted him to be sensitive to the idea, understand what adoption is. So I
Right.
started writing stories because many of our stories in Indian mythology are about adoption. Sita is adopted, Karna is adopted, Krishna is adopted. And there are many others, historical and mythological. And I sort of wrote those stories out to read to him, to my son, to
Mm.
explain to him what adoption is. And I shared it with my friends also who have adopted children.
Okay.
And all of them came back to me saying, "We love these stories. And, if you've written anything else, we'd like to take a look."
Mm-hmm.
And then I put them up on Storyweaver. Those stories are all available on Storyweaver.
Mm.
I put them up about 7, 8 years ago. And now when I look at them, they've been translated into Kannada and Tamil and various languages by other people, because I think they've also found the value in it, because it helps to break the ice with grandparents who are not okay with adoption, to say
Right.
that, look, there are so many precedents in India itself. So the stories are being, used. And I felt very happy that, that it was sort of contributing to that. And also at the same time, validation, like you said, that, maybe I have a talent for this. this, maybe, I can write.
Yeah.
And that's how the journey began. And also, because writing, it allowed me to do what I want around my children's schedule without having to commute 3 hours in a day and be away from them for so long. So all those things contributed to turning, writing was always a hobby, but it turned into a profession after this juncture. Yeah. So
Okay.
that's how it began.
So, your story makes me, once again, I mean, I always believe in this, but I think every woman that I have a conversation with, it is so fascinating to hear how we switch gears, we change our lives, we discover ourselves because, we have certain responsibilities that have come on to us, largely in the form of our children and families, and how we make the
Yeah,
best out of a situation which may not have been what we initially, chose to do in life. So it's actually fascinating and so
absolutely.
inspiring that, like they say, I
Yes,
mean,
yes,
not exactly, I think, the right thing to say, but it's like that lemons and lemonade kind of a thing. If life has given you
yes,
something,
yes.
make the best of it. So wonderful to
Make the
hear,
best of it.
yeah, what you did.
Yeah.
So, as I
Thank you.
understand, you're welcome. You are an MA in Ancient History and Culture, right? So,
Yes, yes.
this and plus your work on the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel's legacy. So, they clearly shaped your interest in the accession of princely states and all that you've written about. So, tell me,
Yeah.
what drew you to this lesser known chapter of Indian history? I mean, I don't think a lot of people have written about it. So, what was it that drew you to this?
Right. So I think it has been shaped, some part of this has been shaped by my professors. I studied in Xavier's College in Mumbai. I did my MA in Ancient Indian History, Archaeology. And many of their views sort of shaped my view on about history, which is, not looking at it typically as a story of kings and wars and political dynasties, but looking at other lenses to look at history. So the history of food, the history of our materials, the history of clothing, the history of our thoughts and ideas, and that has their views and a lot of having a lot of discussions with them, and of course classrooms, and we did a lot of outings, we did a lot of historical trips around India. So I spent a lot of time talking to them, and I think my professors have, in a way, contributed to the way I think about history. And I honestly have I'm not interested in stories that have been told ad nauseum, especially stories about kings and dynasties, and I think we spend too much time fussing about these stories in a large part of our history books. And it's not any one single dynasty, but generally, the dynasties, the kings that ruled, the temples they built, the taxation system they had, and I find that puts children off because they cannot connect with this history. Whereas the kind of history that I learned and I studied through, with my professors, the story of food, how, the food we eat, the games we play, the clothes we wear, the language we speak, the ideas we have, the opinions we have, that is shaped by our past, and that is more dynamic and relevant. People can find meaning in this in history when it is connected through these links. And I always found those lesser known stories more fascinating. And also I feel, what is the point of writing one more book about something that has already been written about so many times? What is my value addition? Whereas something like the accession of princely states, or this book about Kashmir, which generally is not told to children, because it's a complex story, and it's also a violent story to some extent, even when you tone it down. I like this aspect of trying something that has not been done, and not putting in my time and energy into doing one more book or one more story on something which has been done ad nauseum. So that focus, I think, happened because of my teachers and the faculty I had at St. Xavier's. So that was a very, very wonderful experience as a student for me. So I think that has shaped this perspective that I have.
You're so right, actually. So, being from the academia myself, I can totally relate to this because it's the way you are taught something that actually makes a lot of difference. The same
Absolutely.
boring stuff can be made so interesting if your students
Yeah.
are, in some ways they are, you're able to explain the connection to them. You're explain how it applies to them, to their lives. If they can resonate with what you are saying, I think that then
Yes, absolutely.
you don't need to do any more. So yes, I think that it has a very
Yeah.
critical role to play. So Malika, tell us a little
Right.
bit about this book of yours that we are talking about. How did you come to write
Yeah,
about?
sure. I have
Yeah.
a copy to show you the cover here. It's called The Battle for Baramulla. and it's published by Duckbill, a Penguin. And it is, as the name shows, Baramulla is a city in Kashmir. And this story is about what happened in 1947. And part of it also started from a conversation my children had, and they were asking, why are India and Pakistan always fighting? So that actually planted a seed in my head of, children have these questions, and there's really no, and the internet has all kinds of answers, and especially in the day of social media where you get inundated with opinions more than facts, because people are, the loudest person is really the one who catches everybody's attention, and whether it's based on facts, one really doesn't know. So, and especially written for children, there's very little material on Kashmir, and I thought, tracing back to the origin of why this fight about Kashmir began between India and Pakistan, because of course we have many other conflicts, but Kashmir is the main bone of contention for a long, long time between India and Pakistan. And so that is one seed that planted the idea of I should try writing this. But like I told you in the beginning, there is always the moment a thought comes up, the next immediately, even before you plan it, the self-doubt jumps out and says, no, this is too difficult to do. You can't do it for children. 100 other hurdles come up that nobody has tried this. So obviously there must be, it must be difficult. But then, you sort of answer those questions and try and get over those self-doubts. And then I had worked on another book called 565, which is this one here, which is about the accession of princely states. And a lot of the research that I did in that, Kashmir is actually just one chapter in this book about the accession of princely states. And one thread in that Kashmir story led me to a very interesting character called Maqbool Sherwani, who's a historical character. He's a historical person. He was a young boy who actually fought for Kashmir to join India when Pakistan attacked Kashmir in 1947. And so the story is that the ruler of Kashmir was Maharaja Hari Singh. He was ambivalent. He did not want to join India or Pakistan. All the other princely states, there were 500 or 600 odd princely states in India, were given a choice that he could either join India, join Pakistan, or remain free. And Maharaja Hari Singh was one of the many people. There were others also who weren't certain and weren't clear one way or the other. But Hari Singh was the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, was not clear about whether he wanted to join India and Pakistan, and he preferred to stay out of both. Because he was a Hindu ruler in a Muslim majority state with a large Hindu majority, Hindu population in Jammu, a Buddhist population in Ladakh. So he said it's better for me to be independent, and he wanted Kashmir to be turned into a Switzerland of the East. And but that didn't go well. Pakistan attacked Kashmir in October 1947, and then he asked India to help him. The Indian government said that yes, we are willing to help you, but for that you need to first join India, and then we will help you. And then he acceded to India formally, and the Indian army went in, and then of course the skirmish continued, and it still continues to this day. So that is the background to it. But of course, this is just in a nutshell. There is much more that happened. And this person called Maqbool Sherwani, who was caught in this conflict, he actually wanted Kashmir to join India and not Pakistan, because he was a follower of Sheikh Abdullah, who was a leader there, who did not agree with Jinnah's two-nation theory. So the idea that several Muslims in India did not agree with Jinnah's two-nation theory, and they actually stood out against that idea, especially in light of the conflict of Kashmir that continues today, and in light of a lot of our political discussions and suspicion of Kashmiris, suspicions of Muslims. I found this story very, very stark as something that needs to be told. And this person, he actually was a very brave young boy, and he gave up his life for Kashmir, to help Kashmir join India. And he actually died. So he's a martyr. And his story is largely forgotten. Nobody knows outside Baramulla. Maybe the story of Maqbool Sherwani is not much known. And I thought, somebody needs to write about it. And it gave me a good starting point to write about this Kashmir conflict, to explain it to children through a story, but historical fiction with research. So it's not imaginary. But the story around it is told from the lens of a young girl who is his cousin, and see how children see conflict. There is a line in the book where she says, why her friend is leaving and going away because she's a Sikh girl, and they think they'll be persecuted or they'll be killed. So the Sikhs are moving out of Baramulla, and that's her best friend is leaving, and she can't understand why her best friend has to leave. And if Nehru and Abdullah and Jinnah, etc., are having a problem, why do ordinary people have to suffer? So the lens is through the lens of a child who cannot understand conflict, the political conflict, but is affected by it and negatively impacted by it. And at the same time, there's political drama going on around her. So that's the story of the battle for Baramulla. So it's the story of the origin of the Kashmir conflict told through the lens of a young person.
Oh, wonderful. Really sounds very, very fascinating. So tell me now, my next question is related to this, that when you research historical events, especially for the young readers, How do you balance accuracy with accessibility? That's, I think, very important when you're doing it for the young readers.
Right, right. Yeah, that's very a good question, actually. So, accuracy is, of course, paramount when you're talking about history, or when any work of nonfiction. It could be history, it could be science, it could be anything. But if it's nonfiction, there is no room for adding things with your imagination and making things up. So there are two or three things. One is, of course, historical fiction, where the story is historical. That means it is based on a historical event, but it is fiction, so you are adding certain elements, you are adding a character, you're adding emotional pieces, and you're adding imaginary things to factual things, and therefore it's called historical fiction.
Right.
So the Battle of Baramulla is historical fiction because the story of Maqbool Sherwani is true, but the lens of this child, his cousin, through whom the story is seen, there is no such record of such a cousin, and that is something imagined by me. So that's historical fiction. Whereas if you look at this book 565, it is non-fiction, but it is called creative non-fiction, which is one of my favorite genres, actually, it is non-fiction, so I'm not creating anything, I'm not imagining anything, but I have taken the liberty to write the story in a way which is engaging and immersive. So, for example, let's say Nehru and Sardar Patel are writing letters to each other to discuss Kashmir. Instead of showing that as a set of letters, I will show that as a conversation between Nehru and Sardar Patel.
Right.
So I'm not creating the story. I'm not creating the conflict. I'm not making up the fact that they are talking to each other. I'm not making up the content of what they're discussing, but I'm just turning a bunch of 20 letters that went back and forth, which is very dry bone and, it doesn't make for a dramatic scene, and turning that into a dramatic face-to-face conversation. So that's a liberty you've taken by, so you're sort of, it's creative, but at the same time, it is non-fiction because you're not making up stuff that didn't happen.
Right.
So that's really the difference between historical fiction and creative nonfiction. Both are my favorite genres, and I like to read both of them, and I like to write both in both these. But so the challenge is how do you so in both cases it has to be extremely accurate, of course, the research. But in historical fiction, you have that sort of liberty to take make up a few things around the historical fact. But if you're writing nonfiction in that book, there is and a lot of people on Amazon, the reviews that I get, they like that section very much. There is a section called "Did it really happen this way?" where every chapter is followed by a section which explains which part of it happened, how, and if liberties have been taken, what liberties have been taken. So I think as a writer, it's important to disclose to the reader. And very often I find that lacking in many books, because after reading a book which is about a historical book, and the writer says, I've taken certain liberties, I want to know what liberties have been taken, what has been made up and what is not made up, what is real.
Yes.
Even if you see something like Crown on Netflix, which was about Queen Elizabeth and, her family, it was made very well. But not everything is real. And they did make up a few things.
Right.
And they didn't tell us what is made up and what is not. Because after that, I mean, it's nice to have a drama like that. But I think it's good to disclose to the reader or the viewer at the end that this part was not real or it was made up or whatever. So I find that even if you're taking certain liberties and moving away from facts, that disclosure, I think, is very important. And I think that makes it more accessible, taking hard, when you take these liberties, because like I said, if there are 20 letters going back and forth, it is not so readable. It doesn't make for interesting reading. So you can take something based on solid research, take those 20 letters, but take the liberty to make it accessible, readable, engaging, etc. But make the disclosure as well, so that you're being honest with the reader that this is not exactly how it happened. This is how it happened, but I'm taking a few liberties to make it more engaging for the reader.
Which I think is absolutely wonderful, because you are stating the fact, but not in that dry manner in which normally, history books, they take care of all this. So what you're doing is that you're talking about it, but you're making it interesting. And then the message is getting across, which I think is the ultimate objective. All right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So tell me something. Now, this is a woman-centric podcast, so there have to be questions around women and challenges and all of that. So my question is that many women historians and writers, they still struggle to get equal visibility in this field. So have you faced any such challenges in your research, in your writing career?
I don't think I have faced any such, I think it also would depend on where you come from, or how boldly you're able to, get into situations, or how you engage with people. I think if you, I don't feel I am in any negative position because I'm a woman and I can't speak to someone confidently just because I don't have those notions in my head, because I was fortunately in my family not raised as, being told constantly that, you're a girl, you can't do this. I was never told any such thing. So I don't have that sort of lens in my head at all. So I don't see the world through that lens. And if there is a certain situation and I want to do something, I would just, try it and not feel that, oh, I'm not going to be able to do it because I'm a woman. So I think that conditioning is very important. If you have been constantly told that, one would feel, threatened by or intimidated that because of being a woman, I may not get access to some situation. But I've always, if I want to write to somebody, I want to speak to somebody, I've just openly spoken to them, gone up and asked them. So I've never felt that as a limiting factor. And even as a reaction, because I think if it's not perceived from my side, even as a reaction, I have never felt disadvantaged when I pitched to a publisher or at a lit fest, or spoken to historians, spoken to seniors, people, academics, people in the profession. I have never ever felt discriminated against because I'm a woman. But the only factor, I think, is certain. For example, I wanted to research a story which was something, in the forest in Madhya Pradesh when I was writing something. And I had to think about, is it safe to travel? Is it safe to travel alone? This was a little hamlet, outside a jungle. So I think men may not need to, do these checks. But I think that those are some of the factors that women have to consider if you're going to cover a story somewhere in a very remote place. You need to check these, and then plan your travel such that you're not traveling alone at night and things like that, or find out the nearest relative or friend you have in that locality so that in case of emergency you have someone. So these factors definitely working in India as a woman in a non-familiar setting, but growing, in a city where I have been in Mumbai, where I'm familiar with people and familiar with the system here, I have never felt disadvantaged at all because of being a woman.
Right.
So and perhaps that has also got to do, like I said, with my upbringing, where it's not a factor in my mind at all.
So that's what I was coming to, because it is the way you've been raised that also makes a lot of difference. Yes, there are externalities, there are
Absolutely.
external factors, that's one thing, but the way you've been raised, that also makes a lot of difference.
Yes,
how you
matters a lot.
And how do you face
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think my family, my mother is a working woman. She was in the Reserve Bank, and she's a musician. She's a PhD in music. She teaches music. My aunt was a senior counsel in the Bombay High Court. So I have, very strong women in the family. So I think that also passes on. If you have somebody who's also working in the generation before you, then you're sort of less intimidated, and that factor doesn't play in your mind at all. That, oh, I'm a woman, I can't do this, because you've seen your seniors in your family do it. So that doesn't play the factor in my head at all.
Yeah, sure. So continuing with this, in your opinion, how can historical fiction help young women connect with their heritage and understand their place in society today? Because if you look at what women are facing today, maybe you and I are not facing, but a lot of women are.
Yeah.
And also compare it to what was what women were facing in back in the day. So there are similarities. There are certain things which continue to remain. So how do you think this kind of pans out when we look at historical fiction?
I think history has largely been told by men and written by powerful men, and large part of women's stories are, they're not even written or discussed or spoken about. And today's historical fiction, even writing about even mythological fiction, a lot of one of the most popular genres today is writing stories from our ancient legends and epics, but writing it from a woman's perspective. So you have Sita's Ramayana, or you have, stories written about lesser known characters in the Ramayana. Kavita Kane, for example, does a lot of that. Chitra Devakarni Banerjee does that. Draupadi's perspective. Volga is a great writer who actually does a lot of that. Mandodari's perspective, or Sita's perspective, or Urmila's perspective of the Ramayana. So these are lesser known viewpoints of our, stories, legends, and from the epics. Similarly, in history, you have a lot of stories now about, Devika Rangachari has come up with the series of Queen of Ice and Queen of Water and so on, which is all about great queens from our past, from Kashmir to the south. So you have a lot of writers, women writers, writing about women's stories. And I think that definitely, I think presence is a very important thing. When you see yourself in a story, and that person is achieving things, that person is doing things, it also inspires you because you think you can relate to that character. So, for example, when I grew up, a lot of stories that I found in my library were written were about white children. And there were no brown children, there were no Indian children. They were eating like Enid Blyton stories. The
Yeah.
children were eating crumpets and scones. And I had no idea what crumpets and scones were, but I was reading those books and I was enjoying it because we didn't have an alternative, right? But
Yeah.
when you see people like you who have similar outlooks like you, they dress like you, they speak like you, there is a sense of I am visible. And that visibility is very important, I think, for women, which today's historical and mythological fiction books are providing.
Correct, correct. That's very true. And I think they're doing a fabulous job because speaking
Yes.
about things or presenting the other perspective is so, so critical. And that I think they're doing a fabulous
Right.
job there.
Right.
So tell me,
Yes.
Malika,
Yes.
when you write and all
Yeah.
the characters in your books, so do you intentionally include strong female characters or historical women in your work to inspire young readers?
That's very, yeah. Actually, I'm happy you asked this question because that is something that is I consciously and deliberately do. One of the other books of mine that came out a little earlier, a few months ago, is this one. It's called The Case of the Mysterious Witches. It's published by Speaking Tiger, and it's a series of mysteries for young readers, legal mysteries because of my legal background, where children can connect with, learn about legal and police procedure in India through mysteries. So it's a set of children who solve these mysteries.
Okay.
And this one, this entire series, and especially this one, this is about a witch hunting. Like you can see in the picture, this woman is being targeted as a witch,
Right.
and
Right.
it's about witch hunting. Which is still, shockingly prevalent in India even today. Women are accused of being witches, and it's a garb of taking away land and property from them. And they're accused of being, Dayan, Dakin. These are various words that are used across India. And the accusations are made by men, and then some holy man will, validate that, saying, yes, yes, this child in your village is dead because this woman has cast a spell on them or done some black magic. And then that woman is then either murdered or she's thrown out of the village, and her property is then taken by the relatives or somebody else. So it's a very prevalent problem. So it's a woman-centric book. And in this entire series, or in fact, if you see the Battle for Baramulla, the main characters are actually Zuni and her grandmother. There's a young girl, a 14-year-old girl, and her grandmother, who actually is the seed of wisdom throughout the story. During this conflict, Hindu, Muslim, and people fighting. And she is all that she says is, the ancient ideas of Kashmiriyat, which is about unity and communities living together. It all comes from the wise grandmother to the granddaughter, who then passes it on. So many of my characters in my stories are women. And I think, what I said previously, presence is very important. Women who see themselves, girls see themselves in stories. Even in many of my stories, if there's a scene where a family is going out, the mother will be driving the car in some of these scenes, and not the father. It's very typical that you expect the mother to be in the kitchen and the father's doing some work. In many of our stories, it is like that. That
Yeah.
I have deliberately reversed it in most of my stories, where the father is trying to cook some snack for the children, and then the mother is driving them, taking them somewhere else, just to see, to understand very subtly. Of course, this is just in the background scene. That is not the main scene of the story.
Right.
But in the background, I do deliberately try and show these visuals so that children don't take these stereotypical images of mother has to do this and father has to do this and so on, or women or men have to do this. Many of all the women in my stories are working women. And a very important part of the story. So yes, I deliberately and consciously do that in order for girls to feel, feel that they are being represented in these stories, and they are not being represented as some damsels in distress, but
Right.
powerful people who actually make things happen in the story.
And I think, when you do this, when you're changing the narrative like this, then not only the
Yeah.
girls get to see themselves playing all those roles, but there is acceptability from the boys' side also. Because, like we
Yes.
keep saying nowadays that, we have raised daughters and girls who are able to face the new world, but the boys are not being raised or have not been raised boys who can handle such girls or who can face such
Yeah.
strong women.
Yes.
So I think changing the
Yeah.
narrative in this way, where it is perfectly acceptable, perfectly normal for men and women to be doing what have traditionally been considered to be their roles. So I think that's a
Yes.
wonderful
Yes.
job that you're doing.
Yeah, I think that, and the fact to do it subtly, I think, is
Yes,
more important than
yes,
having it in your face. So
absolutely.
similarly, I do that with disability as well, because I have a background of working with people with disabilities, and like I said, I have a lot of children around me who are adopted. So some of my characters in the books are adopted, and it's a very subtle mention. It is not like focus highlighted in the story, because it's just a part of life. It's just another way a child comes into a family. Some of the characters in my books have autism. They have a stutter. To sort of normalize the fact that all kinds of people are around you, and they don't have to be put in some, and many of the books sometimes highlight the hardship or highlight the challenges of the story, which is also good, of course. But I think it's also important to have them as regular characters in your story, as not doing something special. Like he's not a disabled person who's winning the Olympics, but he's just there around you, and he's part of your family, he's in your friends, he's circle, he's in your school, and it's just part of, your day-to-day life. I think that normalization, even like you said, of women, of girls doing things, or people with disabilities, people who are adopted, to have these people of different backgrounds seen in books I think is important for children.
Yes, it is very important. Yeah. So tell me, as a woman navigating the literary world, what advice would you give to aspiring female authors who want to write about history, politics, or whatever?
So first thing, that voice of self-doubt, which is constantly jabbering away inside, try and silence it. There are challenges, there are hurdles, but you can overcome them. There are plenty of examples. J.K. Rowling, for example, is one of the most well-known of the lot, who was rejected 17 times, I think. There are plenty of others who've been rejected multiple times. All of us writers who you see as, with published books like this, nobody has landed a contract the first time they pitched a book. And most importantly, when you see a book like this, this is a complete, the final book, which is in my hands, and you compare it, let's say, with your first draft, and you may think, oh, this is not as good. But you have not seen the first draft of this book, right? Or any of my books. This is the complete product that you're seeing, the finished output. So don't compare your first draft with somebody's complete finished output and think you're falling short. It will definitely fall short, because, editors have worked on it, developmental editors. I've been very lucky to have Sayoni Basu, who is one of the foremost editors in India. Duckbill has come up with some amazing titles in the last few years, and I've always wanted to work with her, and very, very happy to have finally had the chance to work with her on this book. So some very good editors have worked on these books and improved it. So the book that you finally see is not the first draft. So keep that in mind. If you're writing something sketchy and it doesn't look as great or as polished, that's because this is the first version, and the one that you're comparing it with is the final version, and it should not be compared. And of course, don't be intimidated if you want to pitch to a publisher, want to pitch to a writer, a literary agency, whatever, and you get a rejection. That is part of the process. All of us have had rejections. I think all of us, if you speak to writers, definitely me, if all the pitches that I have sent out, I have far more rejections than acceptances, right? And that's part of the story. And you shouldn't get influenced by one or two and give up. Just keep at it, get persistent. And if you're consistently getting rejected, also be critical about your own work and examine why you think the editor didn't pick your book. Maybe you can improve. Always work on improving your craft. I'm always trying to and read a lot, because that will help you improve your craft. Read the kind of things that, if you're writing historical fiction, you should be reading a lot of historical fiction to know what works in the market, how different techniques are used to make stories interesting, and constantly keep improving your drafts, constantly keep working on your draft, and don't assume that this is the best it can get. There is always a better version. You can polish it, improve it, pitch it again, and don't give up. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that was, I think, a wonderful set of tips, which is going to help everyone, because, these are certain things which need to be kept in mind. And sometimes you do know, but, if coming from somebody who is out there, who's got books to their name, that kind of just reiterates, refreshes, and makes you in a way come back, to on track. Okay.
Yeah.
So going back to historical fiction. So my question is that what do you believe is the biggest challenge in writing historical fiction for children and young adults in particular?
Right. The biggest challenge, I think would be, children have this perception, because of the way history is taught in schools and in their textbooks. There is already this perception that history is boring and dull. So you have to overcome that hurdle, because it's not fantasy. It is not, for young adults, romance is perhaps something that genre which they like very much. Or for younger children, fantasy is a genre they like very much. Superhero stories they like very much. And you already don't, if you're writing something in these genres, you don't have that hurdle. But history there is already this notion, oh, yaar, itna bahut boring hai. And then you have to get over that hurdle to make it interesting and appealing to them. So I think that perhaps is the biggest challenge, to draw them in first, and then to keep them engaged, and then to make them enjoy it. So it's a double sort of hurdle that you have to jump over. So that, I think, is the biggest challenge. But it is possible if you write in in an engaging style, in an engaging manner, because all children are curious about their past. In fact, if let's say you sit down with a young child with an old photo album, they all want to know, ye kaun hai, ye chacha kaun hai, ye bua kaun hai, who do I look like, and papa tum jab chote the, how did you look? And so there are lots of questions about the past, so, and they all want to know, because that is the source of where they come from. And we all are innately curious as children about where we came from, where our family came from, and connecting with who I look like, which grandmother looks like whom, or which aunt is related to which uncle. Many children have these kind of questions.
Right.
But we kill that curiosity by making history this dull, boring sequence of events and dates and wars which children cannot connect with. So the
Correct.
curiosity is there. And in India, we have this huge base of so many hundreds and thousands of years of history, where you have so many interesting events, so many complex, diverse events. So you have the base and you have the curiosity. So as a writer, you really have to bridge the two by making it engaging for the children and appealing for them, and overcome these notions which they have of history is boring, by telling them that there is more to history than what you see in your textbooks. So I think that once you're able to overcome that, that link can be built.
Yeah. And there's another thing that I feel, that it is also important for them to for us to make them understand why history is important, apart from the curiosity bit, which is that history teaches us so many things. There are so many lessons to be learned. So that is also something, I think, a point that needs to be driven home, that, like they say, history repeats itself. So there are so many things
Yes,
that
yes.
you can learn about the way certain things are panning out in your world, to understand how to deal with them.
Absolutely.
So my next
Yeah,
question is
so in fact, there is a famous quote of George Orwell, which goes that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future.
yeah,
Because if I am the ruler today, I can dictate how history is written, which is what happens everywhere. The people in power decide how history is written and taught to
right.
their children. So that is, if you are controlling the present, you can control how the past is narrated and represented. And if you can control the past, you can control the future, because then you can change the behavior of people by,
Absolutely.
painting certain communities in certain light, or by talking about, focusing on certain conflicts in history, highlighting certain events in order to shape the consciousness, to shape the opinions of the current generation to vote for you, because that narrative suits you or doesn't suit you or whatever. So history is a tool which is always being used by people in power. And that is, like you rightly said, very important to be aware and conscious of that everything you read on your WhatsApp message, everything you read, see on television or on news, it need not be true. It could
Absolutely.
be part of the truth. It could be one perspective of the truth, or it could be completely false. It is important to verify. It is important to ask questions and find out for yourself, because your opinions, your future, who you're going to vote for, what kind of country you're going to have, what kind of society you're going to have, is shaped by your views on history, because that is constantly being used by those in power to shape your opinion.
Absolutely. So that is what it is. You have to be able to analyze it critically, also
Yes, yes,
look at it, learn from it. And I think that is also something that needs to be impressed upon everyone, I think, and
absolutely.
children in particular.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, moving on from women, from history, from books, to something else that you
Okay.
care so much about. I am sure you know what I'm going to talk about. So, as I understand,
Yes.
you also have a deep passion for trees, which is, pretty
Right.
evident in your YouTube channel, Tree Talk with Malika Ravikumar. So, how do you
Yes,
merge
yes.
this environmental interest with your writing, your public work? How do you do that?
Okay. So yes, I grew up in Mumbai, in a big city where which is not like in a jungle or not in a densely green area. So I knew very little about trees when I was growing up. But I happened to marry my husband is a professor in IIT Bombay, which is
Okay.
a very green part of Mumbai. It's adjacent to the Borivali National Park, and there are lot of trees there. It's actually quite dense in the sense that you have leopards coming into the national park, into the campus. Sometimes you have crocodiles that are there in the lake. So it's quite a wild place in that sense. And I felt, when I was there, I felt quite bad that I didn't know how to identify any of the trees around me except one or two, because I'd grown up in this very urban part, a concretized part of Mumbai, which didn't have so many trees, and I didn't have that interest interest. But when I moved there, and then my husband's family has a lot of environmentalists and people who are into trees and birds, and they knew so many things, and I was always the one saying what is this and what is that, and even children in this family seem to know far more than me. So I just started soaking in that atmosphere, learned a lot from them, and my started noticing these beautiful trees around me, and realized how much we take from trees. And sadly, we can recognize celebrities and film stars and sports stars, but couldn't name 10 trees. So I felt there was something really seriously wrong with that perspective and wanted to correct this. So I enrolled for field botany lessons. I did a lot of courses at the Bombay Natural History Society, learned about insects and birds and trees, and absolutely loved it. And then shared it with my children and their friends and took them on tree walks. And this YouTube channel, which is Tree Talk with Malika Ravikumar, is like an extension of that, where I want to share this joy and love that I have felt, which I felt I was denied because I grew up in a city like many of us in urban settings. And there's nothing that's not for our fault. We didn't do anything wrong, but it's just that the way you are raised in that surrounding, you don't see so many trees, and you don't notice them because you have not, or your attention has not been taken there. But it was so joyful when I discovered these things, and I think a lot of people will also enjoy it. So the Tree Talk channel is an extension of that, sharing that joy sort of thing. So it's really not a professional thing. I don't monetize my channel or anything. There's no hurry to build the channel and turn it into something big. It's just a quiet, slow process of I loved learning about trees, and I want to share this joy with whoever is wants to participate in this, and that's what the channel is. But the first book I wrote was about trees. It's called Tracing Roots. It was published by Karadi Tales, and it is a collection of stories about trees, where I narrate historical, mythological, folk tales, etc., about trees, and then help children. That's what I do on my tree walks as well, because a lot of scientific facts, children don't find it very interesting. And if you say this tree, the botanical name of this tree is Mangifera indica, and this is when it flowers, and this is when it fruits, and so on, you're sort of losing your audience. But when I tell them the story that there's a story that Hanuman brought the mango from Lanka to India when he was searching for Sita, children immediately want to hear more. So I use a lot of folk tales, a lot of historical, mythological tales to connect children with trees. And Tracing Roots was a book where I actually did that. So I narrate the story, and then I tell them about the tree, what the fruit is, when it fruits, or how to identify a particular tree through its leaf, and things like that. So there is information and facts, but after the story, because that's what sticks better. And in fact, that children who actually meet me, who've come on my tree walks earlier, they meet me sometime much later, and they say, "Auntie, the story you told me about that particular tree, I actually saw it flowering in this month." And so they have retained that information about the tree and about the flowers and fruits, but because the story connected with them. So I find storytelling as a very good medium to draw their attention to trees which they have not noticed before.
And I think, I so agree with you. In fact, I think storytelling is the best way that you can relate anything to anyone, because that is how it sticks. Because you've kind of created that hook, because the way you kind of start telling. And when they know it's a story and it's not a lesson, then automatically you've got, I think half the battle is won. And then the other half, of course, with the way you do it and the way you narrate the story, I think then, you've kind of gotten there.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Malika, my final question to you. If you could write a book that combined your love for history and your passion for trees, what would the storyline look like?
So strangely, a lot of my stories, like I was talking about subtly introducing certain ideas, a lot of my stories subtly have trees in the background. For even example, this battle for Baramulla, which we are talking about, you will see there's a chinar leaf here. Chinar is the state tree of Kashmir. And the chinar actually, I don't know, for those who read the book carefully will notice that it appears in every chapter of the book. And it is the season progressing, the events that happen. The chinar is a deciduous tree, so it drops all its leaves, and in winter it becomes bare, and then the leaves grow again. And the process of how the story moves is through the seasonal cycle of the chinar. And in every story, it is like the subtle presence in the background, like some sort of refuge that is a steady refuge that is there throughout the story for the characters who are battling these conflicts. But this tree is always there, looking upon you and protecting you, sort of thing. So somehow or the other, even if the tree is not the main character in my stories, because of my love for trees and what I notice. So even, for example, in this series. The town in which this entire event takes place, or the District Cup is another one of my popular books, which is about football. The town in which that takes place is called Malsari, which was partly inspired by Malgudi days of, the famous Malgudi days, which Malgudi is not a real town, but it's a fictional town that R.K. Narayan created. So Malsari is something I thought I'll create, and Malsari is the name of a tree. It's the Bakul tree. So somewhere or the other, trees always figure in my story in some way or the other, and very subtly also, or like in Tracing Roots, where the book is about trees. But to answer that specific question, I have the idea of working on a story of a history of India told through plants, because a lot of our plants have actually defined and shaped our history. For example, the teak tree, and that's one of the episodes on my channel, how the teak tree changed world history. So the British, we know, conquered large parts of the world. And they did that because they had a very, very strong navy. And what were their naval ships made of? Initially, they were made of oak trees from England. But when they wiped out all their oak forests in England, they didn't have enough wood to build those ships. They actually turned to the teak forests of India. And the teak wood lasted much longer than oak wood. So their oak wood ships would last for, let's say, 60 years. The teak wood ships would last for much longer, almost 100 years. So, the teak has, various properties. It has tannin, so it is insect repellent and so on. It is resistant and so on. So teak wood was very important for the British to build their navy, which was the strongest navy, and they conquered such a large part of the world. So the underlying power of the British navy came from Indian teak. So a lot of our plants in India, a lot of trees, plants have shaped history, and we have never talked about history. We look at it as king-centric or human-centric, but a lot of our trees have, teak is just one example. There are many such plants and trees that have shaped history. So I'm trying to see if I can work on the history of India told through, the lens of plants and trees. So it's not yet concrete. It's not a project, but it's just in my head, and I'm hoping to work on it someday.
That's actually wonderful to know, because I'm sure that'll make for a very, very fascinating read, because you're combining and since you're passionate about both of them, so when you combine both of them, I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating read. So Mallika,
Hopefully, yes, fingers crossed.
Of course, all the best to you.
Yeah.
So while we've come to the end of the conversation, we still have the rapid fire round, which is 5 quick questions,
Okay.
5 quick answers, so you really don't get much time to think. All right. So
are you ready? I'll try my best.
Yeah, all right. So the first one. The first thing you did when you won these awards? Any one of them?
Took a picture with them and shared them with my closest friends and family.
All right. Okay. The next one. One historical figure you'd invite for tea?
Oh, there's definitely Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, which is the next book that is coming out next week. That I would be very happy to invite him for tea if he were alive.
All right. Okay, fine. And then the next one. The first book that you ever loved?
It was called The Day the Clock Stopped. It's a little book, a picture book with Timothy, a character who was a clock man who set all the clocks in town. That was the first book I ever loved, and I still have that book with me.
Oh, lovely, lovely, lovely. So you're like me. All right. The next one. Best writing advice you've ever received?
Best advice I have ever received. Okay, that's a lot of advice I've received, so it's difficult to pin down one. But I would think would be to not give up and to believe in myself, and that especially from my children who liked my books and said, we enjoyed it, and I'm sure other kids will enjoy it too. So be persistent and don't give up.
Wonderful. And coming from them, of course, I think it means the world.
Yes.
And
yes.
Finally, describe yourself in 3 words.
Okay. Tree lover, writer, and mother, I think, if I had to choose only 3 words. Yeah.
Okay. So what should I say? Thank you so much. Such a fascinating, such an engaging conversation. And what actually, came out for me was the sheer passion that you have for writing, for trees, for books, for history. All of that, came out so clearly. I mean, I did not even have to think whether you really care about these things, because you actually do, and it just kind of it came gushing out. And of course, it was absolutely wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much, and all the best to you for all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. It was a pleasure talking to you. The conversation was so free-flowing and smooth and easy, and it was lovely talking to you. Thank you so much once again for having me on the show.
Thank you for tuning in to the About Her show. If you enjoyed this episode, there's plenty more from where that came from. Our previous guests have shared some amazing stories, so be sure to catch up on past episodes. To keep up with our inspiring conversations and to never miss an update, hit subscribe, rate, review, and share the love. Follow us on social media for some great content, and don't forget to check out our website www.aboutherbysangeeta.com for stories that resonate, inspire, and empower. Know a remarkable woman or an inspiring man blazing a trail? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a note at web.abouther@gmail.com and let's bring their story to life on the About Her show.